But first, just when we need to be so much smarter to rebuild this ruined economy, you won't believe what I'm about to tell you. Bruce Pascoe, those crazy politicians in Victoria, unbelievable. But first I'll give you the background, because terrible news today. The growth figures for the last 3 months, they're worse than expected. In fact, it's our worst economic crash on record.
Mr Speaker, this is a devastating day for Australia.
Economic growth in the past 3 months went backwards in this country by 7%, which means the economy actually shrank by 6.3%. And explaining the figures today, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg actually choked up and needed time and some water to compose himself.
We are with you through this crisis, and we will be with you all the way out of this crisis. Before taking a few questions, I'm just going to run through some slides quickly.
Now, there'll be people, and you know the kind, saying, oh, why cry about the economy? It's just money. Put lives first. Because you see, this crash is not actually caused by the virus. It's entirely caused by government bans supposedly to save lives. Well, how many of them actually really do save lives, just for show? But crying over the economy? Well, in fact, no wonder. The economy is not just this abstract thing as a money machine. It's actually people's work, their homes, their savings, what they've built up, their dreams. It's their passport to a better life. And the stories I'm hearing, people not just crying and crying from loneliness, or some from losing their jobs, losing everything they've worked for. A friend of mine, he'll be on the show tomorrow for a whiskey. After all those years, business gone, savings gone, devastating. So I understand anyone who looks at these figures and thinks, oh, my God, those poor people. Now, other countries, yes, it's worse.
We have performed better in the most difficult circumstances than all these other developed nations. Japan, the United States, Germany, the OECD average is just under 10%, Canada at 11.5%, Italy, France, and of course the United Kingdom at over 20%. Over 20%, around 3 times the fall of what we're seeing here in Australia.
And the Treasurer is right. We're not too bad in comparison. It's still pretty bad, but the Prime Minister did try to sound optimistic.
Australia will recover and Australia will grow again and the jobs will come back.
A lot of jobs will come back, but not all of them. Not for a long time. And maybe not your job. And we're also now got a gross debt getting up to $1 trillion to repay and an economy to somehow fix. And all that is going to take a few things. First of all, of course, we're going to have to be braver, more clear-headed, more clear-sighted. We have to consider the kind of arguments that former Prime Minister Tony Abbott made in Britain overnight.
We let fear of falling sick stop us from being fully alive. Surely it's time to relax the rules so that individuals can take more personal responsibility and make more of their own decisions about the risks they're prepared to run.
Now, there was fake outrage today from Labor and the ABC about something else that Tony Abbott said, or allegedly said, but I'll discuss that later in the show. Another thing we will need to get back on our feet is the will to work. But you know, today, Labor was instead demanding more and more welfare.
1 million Australians are unemployed. Another 400,000 will be out of work by Christmas. And Australia is in the worst recession in almost a century. Isn't this the worst time for the Prime Minister to be cutting JobKeeper, cutting JobSeeker and cutting wages of some of the poorest workers in this country?
No, I don't want people to suffer, but here is the problem. The dole is now so high, double what it was, that employers are complaining they cannot get workers, even with this unemployment. Not for childcare and abattoirs and warehouse jobs. I find that people are saying, well, the pay is barely more than the dole, so why work? And there's a third thing we need now. Brains, ingenuity, flexibility. The kind of stuff, really, the qualities that allowed the AFL, our biggest sporting code, the AFL, to announce today its latest big change just to keep its premier competition going, despite the border bans and the Melbourne shutdown. For the first time ever, the AFL Grand Final will not be played in Melbourne.
It is my pleasure to formally announce that the 2020 Toyota AFL Grand Final will be played in Queensland at the GABBA.
Now, the AFL could keep its competition going because they were flexible, but also because so many politicians helped them out. They allowed quarantine hubs for the players, they allowed crowds to gradually come back to the football, socially distancing. And I wonder why we haven't seen that same ingenuity and that same willingness to help companies, other parts of the economy, to keep other parts, less glamorous businesses going. Businesses that still, for all that lack of glamour, also employ so many Australians. For instance, so many examples. Airlines, a very small example. Why haven't we got our airport dogs trained to sniff passengers for the virus, as they've got sniffer dogs to do very successfully in Dubai to open up air travel? Or another one. Why aren't we getting 10-minute test kits for antigens and antibodies to this virus? I've got one upstairs. So that businesses can test workers for the virus every morning to safely open up. We need to be so much more inventive. But do you know what? Stupid Australia. Well, stupid Victoria. We need our best brains. But get this. Victoria not only says, the government down there, not only says, hey, let's now waste even more taxpayers' money by building big wind and solar farms to produce more expensive and unreliable electricity that conks out every time the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. I mean, green power, seriously? How can industry now rebuild with an electricity system stuffed around, broken, unreliable, expensive, all that, thanks to global warming extremists? And Melbourne University, this is what I couldn't believe. This is a true sign of intellectual decline. Melbourne University has just appointed Bruce Pascoe, author of Dark Emu, as a Professor of Indigenous Agriculture, even though all the evidence I've seen shows he is not a single Aboriginal ancestor. Overwhelming evidence, which may, don't know how, somehow be wrong, but which Pascoe refuses to come on the show and discuss. Won't produce any evidence at all. But note this Melbourne University has hired this bloke to be an Indigenous agriculture expert. Seriously? That's because this bloke claims in his book that Aborigines were actually not hunter-gatherers, but somehow farmers living in big towns of 1,000 people. And we should learn from these amazing techniques. By the way, his claims are totally unsupported by evidence and denied by Australia's greatest historian.
There's no evidence that there are Aboriginal townships with permanent houses dependent for most of their food on agriculture. There's just no evidence for it.
Look at this economic devastation today. How can we now afford our politicians and universities to be so crazed with green ideology, so totally irrational, so destructive, when so many Australians now need help to build this economy again as our parents once did? We need them to help restore what we, in our virus panic, have destroyed.